Hello and welcome to Readings in English. This is the place where we bring stories to life to help you improve your English skills while enjoying meaningful and emotional narratives. Whether you're just starting your journey with the English language or looking to deepen your understanding, you've come to the right place. English is one of the most widely spoken languages in the world. It opens doors to new opportunities, connects people from diverse cultures, and gives you the power to share your story with a global audience. But learning English is about more than grammar or vocabulary. It's about understanding, expressing yourself, and feeling confident in your voice. That's why we combine language learning with stories that inspire and touch your heart. Today, we're sharing a very special story called The Language of Hope. It's a tale of resilience, courage, and the power of words. Miguel Alvarez, the story's protagonist, faces incredible challenges as he adjusts to life in a new country while learning English. Through his journey, he discovers that language is not just a tool for communication, but a bridge to dreams, friendships, and self-expression. As we go through this story, pay close attention to the language. Notice how emotions, struggles, and triumphs are expressed through words. And don't worry if you don't understand everything at first. That's part of the learning process. So grab your headphones, settle into a cozy spot, and join us for this inspiring journey with the language of hope. Let's dive into Miguel's world together and see how he turns his challenges into something truly extraordinary. Ready? Let's begin. Miguel Alvarez clutched the strap of his worn backpack as he stood in front of the towering brick building. It was his first day at Shoreline International High School, and his heart pounded in his chest like a drum. The sprawling campus, with its neatly trimmed hedges and pristine windows, seemed far too polished for someone like him. He had arrived in the United States 3 months earlier, leaving behind a small village in Guatemala, and everything here felt for an alien, even. Inside, the hallways buzzed with activity as students moved between lockers and classrooms. Miguel's ears caught snippets of conversations in English words that blended into an incomprehensible hum. He tightened his grip on the schedule in his hand, his eyes scanning for room 103. "Excuse me," he muttered to a passing student, but his words were too soft to register. Feeling invisible, he decided to find the room on his own. After several wrong turns, he stumbled into the classroom just as the bell rang. Heads turned in his direction, and the teacher, a stern-looking woman with glasses perched on her nose, gestured for him to take a seat at the back. Miguel slid into a chair, his cheeks burning under the scrutiny of his classmates. As the lesson began, he quickly realized how lost he was. The teacher's words sounded like a rapid cascade of unfamiliar syllables, leaving him grasping for meaning. His classmates laughed at jokes he couldn't understand, and every whispered comment felt like it was aimed at him. By lunchtime, Miguel was ready to retreat. He carried his tray to the furthest corner of the cafeteria, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The din of the room was overwhelming, and he picked at his food without appetite. "New kid," the voice startled him. A tall boy with messy hair and a smirk leaned over his table. "You even speak English?" Miguel froze. His limited vocabulary left him defenseless against the taunt. The boy laughed and walked away, leaving Miguel feeling smaller than ever. As soon as the bell rang for the next class, he made a mental note to avoid the cafeteria from now on. After school, Miguel wandered the halls, trying to escape the ache in his chest. He found himself standing in front of the library doors. A sign that read "Quiet Zone" beckoned him inside. The soft hush of the space was a welcome contrast to the chaos outside. Rows of books stretched endlessly, and the faint scent of paper filled the air. Exploring the aisles, Miguel's eyes landed on a shelf labeled classics. He pulled out a book titled "The Catcher in the Rye." The title meant nothing to him, but the worn cover and bold letters intrigued him. He opened it and stared at the first line. "If you really want to hear about it, ... Single quotes." The words were simple, yet their meaning eluded him. Still, something about the book called to him. For the first time that day, he felt a flicker of curiosity instead of dread. Miguel sat cross-legged on the carpeted floor of the library, holding The Catcher in the Rye. He flipped through the pages, scanning the words, but the text felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. Frustration bubbled up inside him. Why had he even thought he could understand this? "That's a good book," said a voice, startling him. He looked up to see a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair. She wore a name tag that read Ms. Hammond. Miguel nodded hesitantly. I don't understand." Ms. Hammond smiled gently. "That's okay. Everyone starts somewhere. Do you want some help?" Miguel hesitated. He didn't want to admit his struggle, but her tone wasn't mocking. Reluctantly, he nodded. She knelt beside him and pointed to the first sentence. "Let's take it one word at a time," she said. Under her guidance, Miguel began deciphering the opening sentence. It was slow, painstaking work, but Ms. Hammond's patience made it bearable. When they finished the first paragraph, she handed him a small notebook. "Write down the words you don't know," she instructed, "then look them up later. You'll be amazed how much you'll learn." Miguel nodded, unsure if he could keep up with her expectations, but her encouragement made him want to try. Over the next few days, Miguel returned to the library every afternoon. The space became his refuge, a place where he could work without judgment. He filled the notebook with words and their translations, slowly piecing together meaning. Ms. Hammond introduced him to simpler books, helping him build a foundation. One evening, as he walked back to the boarding house where he lived, Miguel replayed the words in his head. For the first time in months, he felt a small sense of accomplishment. The thought of facing school the next day still filled him with dread, but he clung to the hope that his time in the library would make a difference the following week, Ms. Hammond handed him a dictionary. "This will be your best friend," she said with a smile. Miguel took it carefully, as if it were a treasure. "Thank you," he said, the words clumsy but heartfelt. By the time he left the library that day, Miguel realized he wasn't just learning English. He was rediscovering his love for words of love that had been buried under the weight of survival in a new country. The library wasn't just a quiet zone, it was a lifeline. The morning sunlight streamed through the classroom windows, casting long shadows on the rows of desks. Miguel sat at the back, clutching his notebook tightly, his fingers gripping the edges as though it were a life raft. Today's class was English, and he dreaded every second of it. "All right, everyone," the teacher, Ms. Preston, began, her voice firm but not unkind. "We'll be reading aloud today to practice intonation and expression. Let's start with you, Ethan." She pointed to a tall boy with sandy blonde hair near the front. Ethan stood confidently, holding his book. His voice carried easily through the room, clear and steady. Miguel listened, both impressed and intimidated. English felt effortless for someone like Ethan. When Ethan finished, Ms. Preston's eyes scanned the room. Miguel felt his heart race as her gaze landed on him. "Miguel, your turn," she said. The classroom grew silent. Miguel's palms grew sweaty, and his mouth felt dry. Slowly, he stood and opened his textbook, his eyes scanning the lines. He stumbled through the first sentence, mispronouncing words as quiet snickers filled the room. His face flushed as he tried again, but the words stuck in his throat, awkward and fragmented. Ethan chuckled softly, leaning over to whisper something to a classmate. The laughter spread, though some students exchanged uneasy glances. Ms. Preston raised a hand to silence them, but the damage was done. Miguel felt every pair of eyes on him, each one a spotlight amplifying his humiliation. "Thank you, Miguel Ems," Preston said gently, signaling him to sit. He sank into his chair, wishing he could disappear. The rest of the day passed in a haze. At lunch, Miguel avoided the cafeteria, heading instead to the library. The quiet comfort of the rows of books felt like a shield from the harshness of the outside world. Ms. Hammond noticed his red-rimmed eyes as he approached her desk. "Rough day?" she asked softly. Miguel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Ms. Hammond didn't press him. Instead, she handed him a new book, something simpler, with bright illustrations and large text. "Try this," she said. "It's not about how fast you learn. It's about not giving up." Miguel took the book and found his usual corner. As he turned the pages, the sting of the day's events began to fade, replaced by a flicker of determination. The following week, Miguel returned to the library each day after school. His notebook filled with new words, their meanings scrawled beside them in uneven handwriting. Slowly, he began to recognize patterns in the language. One afternoon, Hammond joined him at his table. "How's it going with the new book?" Miguel smiled shyly. Better. I can read more now. That's wonderful, she said, her eyes lighting up. She placed another book on the table, but this one wasn't for him to read. It was a blank journal. What is this for? He asked. To write your own stories, she replied. You told me you liked to write back home. Why not try it here? Even if it's just a few sentences to start. Miguel hesitated, running his fingers over the smooth cover of the journal. The idea of writing in English felt daunting, but he nodded. That evening, he opened the journal at home. Under the dim light of his desk lamp, he wrote his first sentence in English. The words were simple. My name is Miguel, and I want to tell my story. The process was slow. He wrote in Spanish first, then translated the words into English with the help of his dictionary. It took hours to form a single paragraph, but when he read it back, pride swelled in his chest. Over the next few weeks, Miguel's journal became his constant companion. He wrote about his village, his family, and the journey to America. The stories were fragmented, full of grammatical errors, but they were his. One afternoon, Ms. Hammond asked to see his journal. Nervously, Miguel handed it over. She flipped through the pages, her expression thoughtful. You're a natural storyteller, she said. Your grammar needs work, but your voice is powerful. Her words planted a seed of confidence in Miguel. Encouraged, he began to experiment with his writing, crafting short narratives and attempting poetry. However, outside the library, life remained difficult. Miguel's classmates continued to mock his accent, and Ethan seemed to delight in finding ways to embarrass him. During group projects, Miguel often found himself excluded, his ideas dismissed without consideration. One day, during a group presentation, Ethan interrupted Miguel's attempt to contribute. Why don't you let us handle the talking? Ethan said with a smirk. It'll go faster. The words stung, but Miguel bit his tongue. That evening, he returned to his journal, pouring his frustration into a story about a boy who overcomes great odds to find his place in the world. As he wrote, Miguel realized something. His struggles were part of his story, and every word he learned brought him closer to telling it fully. The dim light of the boarding house flickered as Miguel sat at his small desk, his journal open in front of him. Outside, the muffled sounds of car horns and distant voices drifted through the cracked window. Miguel glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, but his homework sat untouched beside his journal. Between school, his evening shifts washing dishes at a local diner, and his time spent writing, sleep had become a luxury he could no longer afford. His hands ached from scrubbing pots and pans, but his mind churned with ideas. He wanted to finish the short story he had started the night before, one about a young boy who finds strength through adversity. Yet the thought of the unfinished math assignment waiting for him filled him with dread. His landlady knocked on his door, her voice sharp. Miguel, lights out soon. You need rest, yes, Senora, Miguel called back, though he had no intention of stopping. He picked up his pencil again and scribbled a sentence in Spanish before attempting its English translation. The words didn't flow as easily as he wanted. Each sentence felt clunky, like a bridge built with mismatched planks. Frustrated, he closed the journal and leaned back in his chair. The next day at school, Miguel's exhaustion was evident. He struggled to keep his eyes open in class, and when Ms. Preston called on him to answer a question, he froze, unable to piece together the English words. "Miguel," she said, her tone soft but firm, "you need to focus. I know you're trying, but you won't improve if you don't participate." Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Miguel nodded silently, his cheeks burning. At lunch, he avoided the cafeteria once again. Heading to the library, Ms. Hammond greeted him with her usual warmth, but noticed the shadows under his eyes. "You look tired," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "I don't have enough time," Miguel admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "School, work, studying, ... I want to write, but it's too much." Ms. Hammond nodded thoughtfully. "Balancing it all isn't easy, but you're doing something incredible." "Don't forget that," Miguel nodded, though her words didn't lift the weight pressing on his chest. The library still felt like a refuge, but even there, the demands of his life followed him. That evening, Miguel skipped writing entirely to focus on his homework. He hated neglecting his journal, but he knew he couldn't afford to fall behind in his classes. As he solved equations and memorized vocabulary words, he promised himself that he would find a way to balance everything. He had to. The following week, the school announced a group project for the English class. Miguel's stomach tightened as Ms. Preston explained the assignment. Each group would write and present a short play, working together to create characters, dialogue, and a cohesive story. Miguel was paired with Ethan and two other students, Sarah and Mark. He could feel Ethan's dissatisfaction even before the group met after class. "Great," Ethan muttered, folding his arms. "This'll be fun." Miguel swallowed hard, keeping his gaze on the table as Sarah began assigning roles. "Ethan, you can be the lead since you're good at speaking. Mark and I will handle the dialogue." Miguel ... She hesitated, glancing at him. "Maybe you can help with the props or something." Miguel nodded, though disappointment settled heavily in his chest. He had hoped this project might be a chance to contribute creatively, but it seemed his role would be confined to the sidelines. As the days passed, Miguel worked quietly on the props, while the others debated dialogue and plot. He listened intently, absorbing their discussions and mentally crafting his own version of the story. One afternoon, while Ethan and Sarah argued over a line of dialogue, Miguel hesitated before speaking up. "What if the character says something like this?" he suggested, his voice tentative. Ethan rolled his eyes. "Do you even know what that means?" "I think it fits," Sarah interjected, surprising Miguel. Let's try it. To Miguel's amazement, the line stayed in the script. It was a small victory, but it lit a spark of confidence within him. Later that week, the group rehearsed after school. Ethan's irritation with the project boiled over as he stumbled through a scene. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, throwing the script onto the table. "Why do we even have to do this?" Miguel hesitated, then spoke up. "It's about the story," he said carefully, searching for the right words. "Every story matters." Ethan glared at him, but said nothing. The tension lingered for the rest of the rehearsal, but Miguel noticed something shift in Ethan's demeanor. The following day, Ethan surprised everyone by arriving early and offering to rewrite a section of the dialogue. He even asked Miguel for his input, though his tone remained brusque. By the time the group presented their play, the collaboration felt more cohesive. Miguel's ideas had found their way into the final script, and while his role remained small, he felt a sense of accomplishment. After the presentation, Ethan caught up with Miguel in the hallway. "Hey," he said, his voice low, "that line you came up with ... It wasn't bad." Miguel blinked in surprise, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," he said finally, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Ethan shrugged and walked away, but the brief interaction left Miguel feeling lighter. For the first time, he began to see the possibility of forging connections, even in the most unlikely places. The library was unusually quiet that afternoon. Miguel sat at his usual table, his journal open as he struggled to find the right words for a story he had been working on for weeks. He had written and rewritten the first page multiple times, each draft feeling inadequate. Ms. Howman noticed his frustration and approached with a steaming mug of tea. "You look like you're battling a fierce enemy," she joked, setting the mug down beside him. Miguel smiled weakly. "It's harder than I thought. Writing always is," she said, pulling out a chair to sit across from him. "But it's also worth it." "What's the story about?" Miguel hesitated. "It's about a boy who leaves his home to find a new place where he belongs." Ms. Howman tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "That sounds personal." "It is," Miguel admitted. "But I can't get it right. The words ... They don't fit." Ms. Howman leaned back in her chair, her gaze distant. "I know how that feels." Miguel looked up, curious. "You do?" She nodded. "When I came to this country, I didn't speak English either. I was older than you, but the fear of not being understood, it was the same." Miguel's eyes widened. "You weren't born here." "No," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "I was born in Italy. My family moved here when I was 19. Learning English was one of the hardest things I've ever done." Her admission caught Miguel off guard. He had always seen Ms. Howman as someone who belonged in this world, someone who couldn't possibly understand what it felt like to be an outsider. "How did you learn?" he asked. "Books," she replied, "just like you. They were my teachers, my friends. Every page I turned felt like a step forward. Miguel felt a sense of kinship he hadn't expected. "You're really good at English now. Thank you," she said. But it didn't happen overnight. It took years of practice and a lot of mistakes. "Don't be afraid of those, Miguel. Mistakes are part of the journey." Her words stayed with him as he walked home at evening. For the first time, he felt as though he wasn't entirely alone in his struggle. Ms. Hammond had faced the same challenges, and she had overcome them. If she could do it, maybe he could too. The school buzzed with excitement as the literary club announced its annual poetry competition. Flyers decorated the hallways, each one boldly proclaiming, "Find your voice." Miguel read the words over and over as he stood by the bulletin board. The idea of participating both thrilled and terrified him. "You should enter," Ms. Hammond said when he mentioned the competition during their next library session. "I don't think I'm ready," Miguel replied, shaking his head. "My English isn't good enough." Ms. Hammond leaned forward, her gaze steady. "You'll never feel ready, Miguel. That's why it's called a challenge." Her encouragement lingered in his mind as he worked on his journal that night. Tentatively, he began drafting a poem. The lines came slowly, each word carefully chosen and rewritten. He focused on the emotions he wanted to convey: the loneliness of being in a new place, the hope he found in small victories. When he read the finished poem aloud to himself, his voice shook, but there was a quiet pride in hearing his own words. The next day, he handed his submission to Ms. Preston, his English teacher, with trembling hands. The weeks leading up to the competition were nerve-wracking. Miguel practiced reading his poem in front of the mirror, his pronunciation improving with each attempt. Ms. Hammond offered guidance, helping him fine-tune the rhythm and flow. On the day of the competition, Miguel sat backstage with the other participants, his hands clammy and his heart racing. Ethan was among them, his confident demeanor in stark contrast to Miguel's nervous energy. "You look like you're going to pass out," Ethan remarked, though there was no malice in his tone. "I'm fine," Miguel replied, though his voice betrayed his anxiety. When his name was called, Miguel felt as though the world had stopped. He walked onto the stage, the bright lights blinding him momentarily. The audience was a sea of faces, each one waiting for him to speak. He took a deep breath and began. His voice was shaky at first, but as he read, the words took on a life of their own. The room grew silent, the audience hanging on every line. By the time he finished, Miguel's nerves had melted away, replaced by a sense of triumph. The applause was tentative at first, then grew louder. Miguel looked out into the crowd and saw Ms. Hammond clapping, her smile wide with pride. Backstage, Ethan approached him. "Not bad," he said, his usual smirk replaced by something that almost looked like respect. Miguel smiled, his confidence bolstered. The competition hadn't just been about the poem, it had been about proving to himself that he belonged. The aftermath of the poetry competition was surreal for Miguel. Classmates who had barely acknowledged him before now gave him nods of recognition in the hallways. Even Ms. Preston, his English teacher, stopped him after class one day to praise his poem. "You've come a long way, Miguel," she said with a genuine smile. "Your poem showed courage and heart." "Keep it up," Miguel nodded, though he still felt out of place among his peers. The praise was new and unfamiliar, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. Despite the recognition, the quiet whispers and occasional jokes about his accent hadn't disappeared entirely. Ethan, however, seemed to have softened toward him. He no longer made sharp remarks in class, and even offered a small good job when their paths crossed. One afternoon, as Miguel settled into his usual spot in the library, Hammond handed him a flyer. "What's this?" he asked. "The literary club is hosting a showcase next month," she explained. "It's a chance for students to present original work stories, essays, anything they want." Miguel stared at the flyer. "I don't think I can do that," he said quietly. The thought of standing in front of an audience again, this time with a longer piece, felt overwhelming. Ms. Hammond folded her arms, her expression firm but kind. "Why not? You already proved you can captivate an audience." "This is the next step." Miguel hesitated, the doubt gnawing at him. But the idea of presenting a story, of sharing something deeply personal, sparked a flicker of excitement alongside the fear. "I'll think about it," he finally said. That evening, he pulled out his journal and flipped through its pages, searching for inspiration. His mind wandered to the stories he had written about his village, the journey to America, and his struggles to adapt. They weren't perfect, but they were his truth. After days of deliberation, Miguel decided to take the leap. He selected one of his stories, a tale about a boy who leaves his home to seek a better life, and began refining it. Ms. Hammond helped him polish the grammar, and Ethan surprisingly offered to help him practice his presentation. "Why are you helping me?" Miguel asked one afternoon as they rehearsed in an empty classroom. Ethan shrugged. "Your poem was good. I figure your story might be to double quotes." Though Ethan's tone was casual, Miguel sensed an undercurrent of sincerity. They worked together for hours, Miguel stumbling over certain phrases, but improving steadily. By the end of the week, he felt more prepared than he had anticipated. The day of the showcase arrived, and the school auditorium buzzed with energy. Students, teachers, and even parents filled the seats, their conversations blending into a low hum. Miguel stood backstage, clutching his notebook tightly. His heart pounded in his chest, and his palms were slick with sweat. Ms. Hammond appeared beside him, her presence grounding. "You're ready," she said simply. Miguel nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed her. When his name was called, he stepped onto the stage, his legs trembling beneath him. The bright lights blinded him momentarily, but as his eyes adjusted, he spotted Ms. Hammond and Ethan in the crowd. Their encouraging nods gave him a surge of courage. He opened his notebook and began to read. His voice wavered at first, but as he delved deeper into the story, he found his rhythm. The tale unfolded a heartfelt narrative about resilience and hope. The audience was silent, their attention fully on him. When he reached the final sentence, Miguel closed the notebook and looked up. For a moment, the room was still. Then, a wave of applause erupted, filling the auditorium. Miguel's chest swelled with pride, the sound washing over him like a tide. Backstage, Ethan clapped him on the back. "Told you it'd be good," Miguel laughed, the tension in his body finally releasing. "Thanks for helping me," Ethan shrugged, though a small smile tugged at his lips. "You earned it." That evening, Miguel walked home under a sky full of stars, his heart lighter than it had been in months. The showcase had been more than a presentation, it had been a declaration of who he was and who he aspired to become. The day after the showcase, Miguel felt a shift in his world. His story had sparked more than applause, it had opened doors. At lunch, Sarah, one of his classmates, approached him with a smile. "Hey, Miguel," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "That story you read yesterday, it was amazing. I didn't know you could write like that. Single quotes." Miguel blushed, unused to compliments. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. "You should think about joining the literary club," Sarah continued. "We're always looking for new voices." "I think yours would fit perfectly." Miguel hesitated, the idea both exciting and intimidating. "Maybe," he said, unsure if he was ready for such a commitment. By the end of the week, Miguel found himself at the club's first meeting. The room was small but cozy, lined with bookshelves and decorated with student artwork. The club's members greeted him warmly, though he noticed a few curious glances exchanged when he introduced himself. The group leader, a senior named Rachel, handed out a prompt for their first project: write a short story to be published in the school's literary journal. Miguel's pulse quickened. He had never imagined his work being shared beyond the confines of his journal or the occasional classroom presentation. When he returned home that evening, he stared at the blank page in his notebook, the weight of the opportunity pressing down on him. He began drafting a story about a boy navigating to worlds, drawing heavily from his own experiences. The words came slowly, each sentence a labor of love. He rewrote passages countless times, determined to capture the essence of his journey. Weeks later, the club gathered to share their drafts. Miguel's hands trembled as he read his story aloud. When he finished, the room was silent. Then Rachel spoke up. "Miguel, your story is powerful," she said. "You have a unique voice. But there are areas where the grammar could be improved." Miguel nodded, her critique cutting deeper than he had expected. He knew his English wasn't perfect, but hearing it pointed out in front of his peers stung. After the meeting, Ms. Hammond found him in the library. "How did it go?" she asked. Miguel shrugged. They said it needs work. That's not a bad thing, she said gently. Even the best writers revise their work. Use their feedback to make your story stronger. Encouraged by her words, Miguel spent the next week refining his story. He read it aloud multiple times, tweaking phrases and reworking dialogue until it felt right. When he submitted the final version to the journal, he felt a mix of pride and nervousness. The literary journal was published at the end of the semester, and Miguel's story was featured prominently. Seeing his name in print felt surreal, a tangible validation of his hard work. His classmates, even those who had mocked him in the past, offered congratulations. Ethan, ever the enigma, gave him a simple nod in passing, but the euphoria was short-lived. During an English class discussion about the journal, one student raised a hand. Ms. Preston, I liked Miguel's story, but it felt ... Simple compared to the others. The comment wasn't meant to be cruel, but it hit Miguel like a punch to the gut. He sank lower in his seat, his earlier pride evaporating. After class, Ms. Preston stopped him. Miguel, don't let that comment discourage you, she said. Writing isn't about impressing everyone. It's about telling your truth, and you did that beautifully. Her words offered some comfort, but Miguel couldn't shake the feeling of inadequacy. That evening, he sat at his desk, staring at his journal. He wanted to write something new, something that would prove he belonged in the literary world, but no words came. The next day, Ms. Hammond found him in the library, his head buried in his arms. What's wrong? She asked. Miguel hesitated, then said, Maybe I'm not as good as I thought. My story wasn't enough, Ms. Hammond's expression softened. Miguel, writing isn't about being perfect. It's about growth. You've already come so far. Don't stop now. Inspired by her encouragement, Miguel decided to try again. He began a new story, one that blended his cultural background with his experiences in America. This time he focused on authenticity rather than perfection. When he shared the first draft with Ms. Hammond, her eyes glistened with emotion. This is your best work yet, she said. Keep going, Miguel nodded, determination replacing his doubt. For the first time he realized that his voice, flawed but genuine, was enough. Miguel's new story took shape over the following weeks, growing into a narrative that felt deeply personal. It was about a boy navigating the challenges of living between two worlds, much like himself. He wrote with a renewed sense of purpose, drawing on memories of his village and the struggles he faced adjusting to life in America. Every evening, Miguel worked on the story after finishing his homework and his shift at the diner. The words didn't come easily, but he was patient, revising each paragraph until it felt right. With Ms. Hammond's guidance, he polished the grammar and refined the dialogue. When the story was complete, Miguel submitted it to the literary club for their review. The following week, the club gathered to discuss the submissions for the upcoming journal issue. Miguel's heart raced as Rachel, the club leader, began reading feedback aloud. "Miguel, your story was beautiful," Rachel said. "It's raw and heartfelt, and it captures an experience that many of us haven't lived but can now understand through your words." Miguel felt a wave of relief and pride, but Rachel continued, "That said, there are still a few places where the language could be smoother. We'd like to work with you to polish it for publication." Miguel nodded, grateful for the opportunity to improve. He spent the next few days refining the story further, collaborating with Rachel and Ms. Hammond. Their support and constructive criticism gave him the confidence to embrace the process of growth. When the revised story was finalized, it was accepted for the journal's special edition. This time, Miguel didn't feel the nagging insecurity he had experienced before. He knew his voice mattered, and he was proud of how far he had come. On the day the journal was published, Miguel received his copy with trembling hands. Flipping through the pages, he found his story and read the title, "Bridges of Hope." Seeing his name beneath it filled him with a profound sense of accomplishment. Later that afternoon, Ms. Hammond found him in the library. "You should be proud, Miguel," she said. "This story will inspire others, just like books inspired you." Miguel smiled, feeling the weight of her words. For the first time, he believed her. The following weeks brought unexpected opportunities. Miguel's story gained attention beyond the school, with a local newspaper featuring it in a column about immigrant voices. The recognition opened doors Miguel had never imagined. One afternoon, Ms. Preston pulled Miguel aside after class. "I've been contacted by a local organization that supports young writers," she said. "They'd like to invite you to speak at their upcoming event." Miguel's initial reaction was panic. The thought of speaking in front of an audience, especially about his journey, felt daunting. But as he considered it, he realized how much he had grown since his first shaky attempt at public speaking during the poetry competition. This wasn't just about him, it was about sharing his story to inspire others. With Ms. Hammond's help, Miguel prepared his speech. On the day of the event, he stood on the stage of a community center, facing an audience that included students, teachers, and local writers. He spoke about his struggles with language, his love for stories, and the people who'd supported him along the way. "Words have power," Miguel said, his voice steady. "They can bridge gaps and build understanding." Learning English wasn't just about communication. For me, it was about finding hope. The applause that followed was overwhelming. Miguel's chest swelled with pride as he realized the impact his words had made. Back at school, the literary club invited him to mentor younger students who were new to English. Miguel embraced the role, seeing it as a chance to give back and help others the way Ms. Hammond and his classmates had helped him. Months later, as Miguel sat in the library, flipping through his journal, Ms. Hammond approached him with a smile. "You've come a long way," she said. Miguel nodded, his gaze lingering on the pages filled with his early struggles and triumphs. "I couldn't have done it without you." Ms. Hammond shook her head. "You did this, Miguel. You found your voice, and now you're helping others find theirs." As he left the library that day, Miguel felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had started his journey as a boy lost in a new world, but he had found his place through stories and the power of language. The road ahead still held challenges, but Miguel knew he was ready to face them, because now he wasn't just learning a language, he was using it to tell his story.